faithfully delivering value, interpreting great books worldwide. Hello, this is Sally's Book Talk. Today we're going to interpret for you the book Bleak House, written by the famous British author Dickens. In life, when disputes arise, we often resolve them through legal channels, hoping to gain fairness. But is justice really the symbol of fairness? The novel we're discussing today, Bleak House, is a legal story about a battle over a massive inheritance. Bleak House is hailed as the world's first legal-themed novel, centered around a 19th century British inheritance lawsuit, depicting the rise and fall of various characters. First, let's introduce this inheritance case. Simply put, the case started with a man named Jarndyce who passed away, leaving a huge inheritance but no clear will. How big was it? The book never specifies. It's a mysterious figure. All sorts of people connected to Jarndyce thought the estate was astronomical, each believing they could grab a slice of the pie. So they argued fiercely over the inheritance, finally taking it to court and submitting it to the Chancery. The so-called Chancery was a court in the British High Court at the time, responsible for civil disputes like real estate trusts, inheritance, partnerships, and bankruptcies. At the same time, it was a prime example of a bloated bureaucracy with mediocre, greedy officials and profit-driven judges and lawyers who habitually delayed cases to extract huge fees. Right at the start, Dickens uses London's smog to reveal the truth about the Chancery. November in London is cold and rainy, streets full of mud, pedestrians falling one after another. No one, young or old, high or low, escapes the fog's torment. Then Dickens shifts gears, saying the Chancery's darkness is thicker than that fog, deeper than the mud. Anyone who goes to the Chancery to litigate can't avoid being driven mad by its convoluted procedures and awful bureaucracy. When court is in session, it's solemn and grand, with piles of documents like indictments, counter-indictments, and defenses on the desk. These documents, consuming vast resources, are just procedural formalities with very little practical use. Judges in wigs, lawyers in fancy robes, they look majestic, symbolizing the law's dignity, that their behavior is completely mechanical, just following procedures. During trials, if any party submits new affidavits or materials, the trial might halt, causing changes in the litigation process. Other parties then have to leave the court and wait for a new hearing notice. Meanwhile, they rush to inquire about the new procedures, then re-prepare all sorts of materials, and the parties pay litigation fees time and again. Even though they know how torturous this court system is, they still have to participate, hoping to see progress in the case and get a favorable outcome. Even more absurdly, the court takes a summer vacation every year. Almost all judges go on holiday, leaving only one on duty who checks in every 2 weeks, then goes to a seafood shop to drink ginger beer with ice. During the holidays, mail and packages sent to the court pile up outside, with no one attending to them. Dickens compares the idle court to a grand ship, built with expensive wood, ironclad edges, brass fittings, looking splendid and noble, but purely decorative. At this point, the parties, no matter how worried they are about the case, even like ants on a hot pan, can only fret helplessly with no solution. John Jarndyce, the main character in the book, once described his experience attending Chancery Court hearings with these words: "We are always appearing and withdrawing from court, swearing and questioning, submitting documents, submitting rebuttals to debate, stamping seals, filing motions, citing evidence, making reports, circling around the chancellor and his entourage in a frenzy until we drop dead." Next, the novel begins to tell about the people deeply harmed by the Chancery. These people are all connected to the Jarndyce inheritance case to varying degrees, mainly divided into three groups. The first group is the deeply affected victims of the inheritance case. The second group is the central characters of the novel, They are also within the influence of the inheritance case, but held their ground and avoided harm. The third group consists of people from society who got involved by chance, from nobles to commoners. These three groups are interconnected, forming a complex web of relationships bound together by endless court sessions and the lawyer's profit seeking. First, let's look at the first group, the deeply affected parties. The character Dickens describes in most detail is Miss Flight, who lives near the court. And for 20 years, she's been in and out of the court countless times, attending hearings by day and tossing and turning sleeplessly night after night. No one knows what connection she has to this inheritance, but yet she's convinced that once the case is decided, she'll get some money to fix up her old house. She keeps lots of birds like larks, finches, and goldfinches. She promises that as soon as the verdict comes down, she'll release the birds to pray for good luck for herself. But over time, she's raised and lost more than 20 birds, and the case still drags on, with no end. Countless people have watched her go from a vibrant young woman to a shriveled, crazed old lady. Regarding Miss Flight's tragic fate, her landlord Crook had a string of sharp metaphors. He said, dealing with the chancery is like being ground to powder in a slowly turning mill. It's like roasting something over a low flame, like being stung to death by a single bee, like water dripping drop by drop until you drown. It's like enduring year after year, being driven mad bit by bit, but Miss Flight at least is still hanging on. In the novel, Dickens also wrote about litigants who lost their lives over this, like the central character John Jarndyce. He had an uncle who was so consumed by the case that he couldn't sleep and finally killed himself in despair. Dickens wrote that many parties were summoned back and forth by the court and eventually died of mental breakdowns one by one. Their skulls were taken down by the landlord Crook, cleaned up, and piled in the shop for sale. Crook is a junk-dealing drunkard who lives off the court. His shop has dead men's skulls and heaps of legal documents. They were once grand, but now they're faded, dog-eared, and worthless. Nevertheless, hundreds of keys to law offices and safes are discarded in his shop, rusted. Barristers' robes are all sold to him, too. Later, they became messy scraps of cloth. You could say Crook's home is the court's sewer, the victim's graveyard. Whenever someone comes by to chat about the court, Crook puts on a know-it-all act and rambles on about his dealings with it. But when the novel hits its midpoint, Crook dies, and his death is downright bizarre. One night, his body actually caught fire all by itself. When others found him, Crook was nothing but a pile of blackened remains. The surrounding floor and papers were all charred, and the novel writes that he died like all the great justices of the court, like all the fraudulent and like all the corrupt local officials in the dark. Now, let's look at the second group of characters, those who remained untainted despite being within the inheritance case's influence. The central figure is John Jarndyce. As mentioned, while his uncle committed suicide over the case, John stayed away from lawsuits and trials, never expecting anything from the court. After John's uncle died, he left behind a desolate residence, the Bleak house from the title, which was part of the disputed inheritance. John inherited it and lived there while awaiting the perpetually delayed court decision. John kept a clear head, never entangled in lawsuits nor scheming to monopolize the property. On the contrary, whenever others discussed the case with him, John would warn, "I've seen with my own eyes those frantic parties spinning around, chasing court fees and legal expenses, or bribing lawyers and judges, step by step toward ruin. So I advise you, don't get too deep into it either." As the novel's most positive character, John stayed detached. He knew others couldn't resist money's lure, but focused instead on protecting and nurturing youth rather than wasting energy on the inheritance case. He generously supported several young relatives as their guardian, housing them at Bleak House as stewards. The most prominent was Esther, an illegitimate daughter raised by her aunt, who never revealed Esther's birth mother, only repeating, "Your mother is your disgrace, and you are hers. Since you were born in such disgrace, you must live humbly and restrainedly, redeeming yourself through hard work." Esther obeyed. She truly lived this way. Later, John noticed this virtuous girl. After the aunt's death, John funded Esther's education, then brought her to London, to Bleak House, to be the housekeeper. While others scrambled for the inheritance, John and Esther stood apart like a pure stream. From chapter 3 onward, the novel is written from Esther's perspective. Esther recounts her life, her interactions with John and others, her meetings with lawyers involved in the inheritance case, and how she came to know Miss Flight. Miss Flight also took a liking to Esther. Miss Flight even said that once the verdict came, she'd leave her inheritance to Esther. But Esther had no interest in this. She diligently followed John Jarndyce's instructions to manage Bleak House, and John also entrusted her with caring for two distant relatives, a young man named Richard and his girlfriend Ada. Esther and Ada became fast friends, and Esther's virtues subtly influenced Ada over time. While the inheritance case dragged through endless darkness, Esther, Richard, and Ada created a sanctuary at Bleak House. Yet news of the lawsuit still intruded, and the deranged Miss Flight repeatedly stirred the pot in the ears of John, Esther, and Richard. John and Esther remained unmoved, but Richard grew fascinated by the inheritance case. Richard was handsome and had taken John's advice to study surgery. But after hearing about the case, he started fantasizing about inheriting part of the fortune. So he abandoned his medical studies, joined a law firm, befriended opportunistic lawyers, and devoted all his energy to researching the case. Later, ignoring John and Esther's warnings, he married Ada young. Struggling financially, he grew desperate and pinned all hopes on the inheritance, until his illusions shattered. Under immense psychological strain, Richard's health deteriorated, and by the novel's end, when the Chancery held its final hearing, Richard dragged his sick body to court. He heard the verdict. While entitled to a share, the entire estate had been consumed by legal fees, leaving him with nothing. Richard stood dumbfounded like stone. He wanted to charge forward and curse the Chancellor, but instead coughed up blood and never recovered. Facing visiting John and Ada, Richard wept uncontrollably with regret. Yet before dying, he still received John's blessing. John says, "People inevitably waver and get confused in the face of wealth, but luckily the dark clouds have cleared and everything's bright now." Richard replied, "This is a painful lesson, a nightmare. Thank you for still pitying that dreamer. Thank you for comforting me and encouraging me to start life anew." Richard passed away, becoming another victim of this inheritance case. Fortunately, he awakened in time and reconciled with close companions like John, Esther, and Ada. Next, Dickens cleverly introduces the third group of characters centered around the Deadlocks. This group includes both the highest nobles in society and the poorest commoners. They're unexpectedly connected through the activities of a scheming lawyer. The nobles referred to here are the Deadlocks. One day, their family lawyer submitted a document about the inheritance lawsuit to the Deadlocks. As Lady Deadlock looked it over, she suddenly recognized a familiar handwriting and blurted out, "Who copied this document?" This question unveiled the story behind this noble family. Lady Deadlock is 40, graceful and elegant, while her husband, Sir Deadlock, is over 60, obedient to his cold and proud wife. They live glamorously with luxurious estates in London and Paris. However, Lady Deadlock was very nervous when she saw the handwriting on the document because she recognized it as her former lover's. This man was named Captain Houghton. Lady Deadlock had a passionate affair with him and gave birth to a daughter. Although the daughter died young, Lady Deadlock still feared that exposing this private matter would ruin her reputation. But the more you fear something, the more likely it is to happen. Lady Dedlock's question caught the family lawyer's attention. As soon as he saw Lady Dedlock's unusual reaction, he concluded something was amiss and immediately went to find the copyist, resulting in locating Captain Hawdon. Hawdon had long been destitute, living in a filthy, chaotic slum, making a living by copying legal documents for the court, not even using his real name anymore. Instead, he used a Latinized pseudonym Nemo, meaning nobody. When the lawyer, through all means, found Nemo's residence and finally entered his home, Nemo had already died from an opium overdose. Nemo was buried in a pauper's cemetery. But the lawyer wouldn't give up. He shifted his investigation to Nemo's friends. Now, Joe was a street sweeping boy living in the slums. Nemo had pitied him and often gave him money. Now, this sinister lawyer set his sights on Joe, tracking his movements to uncover more about Nemo. He also knew Lady Dedlock would likely seek out Joe, allowing him to gather crucial intelligence. Sure enough, after learning of her lover Nemo's death, Lady Dedlock disguised herself as a maid and went to Joe's slum. She found Joe, paid him a gold coin to take her to Nemo's grave, and mourned there. Joe had never seen a gold coin before. After getting it from Lady Dedlock, he held it up to the light, checking repeatedly to confirm it was real. On his way back, every time he passed a gas lamp, Joe would take out the coin again, shaking it, biting it, feeling the reality of his possession. From Nemo to Joe, Dickens' third group of characters emerged, drawing readers into the sunless underworld of London where Joe lived. Dickens depicted this underworld with gloomy tones yet masterful prose, each metaphor utterly brilliant. The famous Russian-American writer Nabokov highlighted these metaphors in lectures, like how lamplighters snuffing out flames resembled executioners beheading little lights in the darkness. For example, Dickens said slum houses looked blind-eyed with their glassless windows and poor children's injuries. Dickens wrote their legs resembled disaster catalogs. Joe lived in these sunless slums alongside many other unfortunate children. They all shouldered life's burdens far too young. One family had 3 orphans, a 13-year-old sister washing clothes daily to feed her 5-year-old brother and 1-year-old sister, the wash tub too tall for her small frame, so she put on her dead mother's thick-soled shoes. As for Joe, he couldn't read a single word. His only certainty was paying the slum's rent each month. Yet, such an innocent boy with nothing was dragged into the scheming and plotting of adults. In the novel, Dickens compares all legal workers to dense fog and mud. The judges are like that, and so is this lawyer who has sadistic tendencies, despite being wealthy and of high social status himself. Under the guise of seeking truth, he relentlessly pursues Lady Dedlock's affair and summons Joe to intimidate and bribe him. He demands Joe testify to the police, saying he saw Lady Dedlock visit the slums, terrifying the naive and ignorant Joe. He does all this merely out of a voyeuristic desire to pry into the privacy of the upper class and others' secrets. Under the lawyer's relentless pursuit, Sir Dedlock, fearing Joe might leak Lady Dedlock's secrets and ruin his reputation, hires detectives to force Joe out of his home. Poor Joe can't even stay in the slums, wanders the streets, and eventually contracts the plague. Although rescued by John and Esther and stayed at Bleak House for a while, he ultimately died tragically. Meanwhile, Lady Dedlock, upon learning of her former lover's tragic situation, also discovers the whereabouts of his illegitimate daughter. She thought her daughter had long been dead, but it turns out she's alive and well, and she is Esther from Bleak House. So, after some twists and turns, Lady Dedlock finds an opportunity to go to Bleak House to meet her daughter. Thus, the main characters of the novel converge, and by now, Esther has married. Lady Dedlock is naturally joyful to see her daughter, but she sadly says, we can never meet again because this scandal could be exposed by the lawyer at any moment, destroying you and your family. She never shakes off the fear, and her health deteriorates. Finally, on a stormy night, she leaves, goes alone to the cemetery where her former lover is buried, collapses in the cold mud, and never rises again. When news of her death arrives, her husband is devastated and falls ill. Thus, Lady Dedlock, her lover Nemo, and the street boy Joe, who were not directly involved in the inheritance case, all because of a lawyer's stirring up trouble, their fates intersected and each met an untimely death. While narrating the stories of these three main groups, Dickens showcases his masterful web-like storytelling technique. Before writing Bleak House, Dickens was always great at picaresque tales, like the Pickwick Papers and Oliver Twist. With the protagonist wandering everywhere, all kinds of events got strung together, forming a linear structure. And but Bleak House doesn't have a wandering main character. Instead, it's set against a lawsuit, with multiple groups of people building an interconnected web. For instance, the half-crazy old lady Miss Flight keeps running into John, Esther, Richard, and others, sparking Richard's interest in the inheritance case. Lady Dedlock, living in aristocratic society, ends up connecting with the street sweeper because she's searching for her old lover. Lady Dedlock then learns that Esther is her daughter. Even though Joe is an orphan at the bottom of society, because he knows Mr. Nemo, he catches the eye of both Lady Dedlock and the legal world, plus he interacts with John and Esther at Bleak House. This network of relationships ties all social classes together, passing on a sense of shared fate to readers. One person's anxiety triggers others' anxiety. One person's hardship is also a struggle everyone has to face. In Bleak House, this anxiety and hardship involve every layer of British society. And the root cause of this hardship is the very judicial system that the British pride themselves on. The British often proudly believe they have the most advanced judicial system, protecting Britain's economic rise. But Dickens doesn't agree. In Bleak House, he writes that the wigs of the Chancery blend into the thick fog, with ruined homes and barren lands everywhere, and every madhouse filled with people it's tormented into inhuman shapes. Every churchyard has people wronged to death by it and plaintiffs it's bankrupted. With all kinds of tricks, it bullies the good, draining people's money and patience, wiping out their courage and hope. That's how it wears people down and breaks their hearts. In contrast to this criticism is Dickens's compassion for the hardworking poor at the bottom. The novel spends a whole half chapter writing about the street sweeper boy. In his lifetime, Joe was a forgotten man by society. Orphaned, almost nameless like his friend Nemo, just a simple label, dressed in rags with no basic education, not even knowing the simplest Christian prayers. He only knew Nemo, and that brought him endless trouble. But Joe also met kind people, John and Esther from Bleak House. Before he died, he was helped by a kind doctor who turned out to be Esther's fiancé, Dr. Woodcourt. Joe learned a prayer, though he couldn't even remember it. But his last wish came true, to be buried beside his friend Nemo. This poor orphan, in his final moments, did feel some human warmth after all. In Dickens' time, Britain had a nominally civilized legal system, but no laws protecting orphans. The only fate for orphans was to wander the streets and die destitute. Joe's fate mirrored that of most orphans in Britain back then. As Joe closed his eyes, Dickens lamented, "Dead. Your Majesty is dead. Princes and nobles are dead. Respectable and unrespectable clergy, dead. Men and women born with God's compassion, dead. Every day people around us die this way." Compared to Joe's tragic death, the illegitimate Esther was fortunate. Though abandoned and essentially orphaned, she was blessed to meet Mr. John Jarndyce and settle at Bleak House. With Jarndyce, she witnessed all sides of the inheritance case and saw her birth mother, Lady Dedlock's tragic fate. She knew the judiciary's darkness intimately, so she followed Jarndyce steadfastly. When Dickens created Jarndyce, embodying purity and kindness in Bleak House, he was middle-aged, having witnessed Britain's social reforms. He saw clearly how impossible it was to change this corrupt, rigid system. Institutions like the Chancery would endure. So what about those at society's bottom, especially orphans and street children? Through Esther's story, Dickens appeals for more figures like Jarndyce, enlightened, rational, fatherly, in a poisoned society. They must use conscience to give true care, guidance, and moral education, fostering inner peace and independent thought so youth don't lose their way in darkness. After 20 years of delays, this inheritance dispute finally concluded. Though dark forces persisted, the book describes people cheerfully flooding from courthouse gates while case files were bundled and hauled away. Whether it's the parties, spectators, or court clerks, everyone is beaming with joy. Even the crazy Miss Flight feels relieved and releases all her remaining birds. No one got a share of the inheritance, yet people are celebrating so joyously. At this moment, happiness has nothing to do with money. With their celebration, people cast a scornful glance at the chancery and judicial system, offering some comfort to the dead. After experiencing temptation, deceit, torment, and disillusionment, people can still regain inner peace and happiness, understanding this is a precious treasure they possess independently of the outside world. All right, that's the end of our interpretation of Dickens' Bleak House. The reading notes are below the audio. See you tomorrow.